Principle 1, the way I would title it, is a career or a calling. Ironically, the very first quality of a great leader is often their decided lack of interest in becoming one. A hallmark of some of the greatest leaders in history is that they did not begin their life with grand visions or aspirations for leadership, but rather humbly responded to an urgent call of the hour. Take, for example, the first and most influential Jewish leader of all times. I refer, of course, to Moses, to Moshe Rabbeinu, who for thousands of years has inspired not just Jewish leadership, but universal leadership, as beautifully documented in a book titled America's Prophet by Bruce Feiler. Let's look at text 1. Our sages teach that the Holy One, blessed be He, spent a full 7 days persuading Moshe at the thorn bush to undertake his mission. It wasn't ambition, but altruism that drove Moshe to begrudgingly assume the mantle of Jewish leadership and speak truth to power when confronting the mighty Pharaoh on behalf of a small group of herding Jewish slaves. It wasn't a lofty idea of a grand vision to transform a depraved band of slaves into a Mamlechet Kohanim, nation of priests, that drove Moshe to become a mouthpiece for God and his people. And it wasn't a hunger to leave his mark on history that burned in Moses' belly when he entered the world of politics and became public servant number 1. What drew Moshe to activism was far less imposing, but no less impressive. It was a weighty sense of duty to ease the pain of a fellow human being enduring a beating. Let's look at text number 2. Quote from the Torah. And it came to pass in those days that Moshe grew up and went out to his brothers and looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian man striking a Hebrew man of his brothers. He turned this way and that way, and he saw that there was no man, so he struck the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. Friends, it wasn't a reward, but a response that spurred Moshe to greatness. And the Rebbe's legendary leadership began similarly, not as a career, but as a calling. After the passing of his father-in-law, a blessed memory, he incessantly refused the relentless requests of Hasidim that he become the new Rebbe. And like Moshe, whose initial response to the prospect of leadership was, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and take the children out of Egypt?" the Rebbe too initially responded with expressions of inadequacy. I'm going to quote a letter the Rebbe wrote. "I received your letter proposing my candidacy as Rebbe, and I was shocked to read it, demanding matters that are not part of me. I do not blame you because you don't know me personally, but at least you should have checked before writing to me." When a certain Rabbi Dubov, a prominent Chabad Chassid, urged the Rebbe to assume the mantle of leadership, the Rebbe questioned the very assumption that he was fit for leadership by exclaiming, and I quote, "What do you suppose, that Mendel Schneerson is a Rebbe?" Indeed, so opposed was the Rebbe to assuming the leadership, until at one point he even threatened to run away. He told the Hasidim, "I will go to a place you will not be able to find me if you don't stop pressuring me to take this role." And as late as 2 weeks before he eventually accepted the position of Rebbe, he was still vehemently objecting to the nomination. On January 2nd, a group of Hasidim came to see him with a coronation letter. After reading just the first sentence, the Rebbe folded the letter, he put it on the table, and with tears in his eyes, he said, "Please leave. This letter has no relevance to me." So what changed the Rebbe's resolve, you may ask, and consequently, the history of Judaism in post-war America? A pointed comment from his wife is said to have made all of the difference. The Rebbetzin Chaya Mushka, she said to the Rebbe, "If you don't become Rebbe, 30 years of my father's life will have gone to waste." Only once put that way, as an urgent call of the hour, rather than an opportunity for influence, did the Rebbe consider sacrificing his privacy and personal life for the public and all-consuming life of a Hasidic Rebbe. Years later, the Rebbe would allude to his wife's urging in a conversation with Rabbi Herbert Wiener, the author of 9.5 Mystics. The Rebbe said, and I quote, "To begin with, it is always easy to run away from responsibility. But what if running might destroy the congregation? And suppose they put a key in your pocket and then they ran away. What can you do then?" Clearly, the mantle of leadership had not grown on the Rebbe over the years. And as the following rare letter he wrote to Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz demonstrates, the Rebbe's activism and public service did not derive from his natural disposition and personality. And I quote, "I must emphasize that despite the aforementioned urging you to be active in communal affairs, it remains now, just as it was when we met in person, that I myself take absolutely no pleasure in being involved in communal affairs." In sum, great leaders don't set out to change history, but respond to history's call for change when it comes knocking at their door. And so the first principle of leadership, then, is to serve altruistically and for the sake of others and for the cause. Keeping this principle in mind and at the forefront of one's consciousness helps ensure that the other principles of highly effective leadership follow naturally. Which brings me to principle 2, not the why of leadership, but the who. That is to say, who is one here to serve? The second quality of leadership is the absolute commitment to service. As the following samples demonstrate, the Rebbe was an extraordinary example of someone who viewed not just his position or his function, but his very existence as being bound up in the service of others. Let me share with you, on a bit of a personal note, the story that has most deeply impacted me over the past years. But first, let me share with you the little anecdote told about a fellow who came to see his therapist struggling with depression for many years. And at some point, his therapist told him, "Listen, sir, I've run out of options. My only suggestion to you is to go and see the happiest person in town, whose name is Coco the Clown. And he distributes good cheer and happiness to everybody. Go and see him as a last resort." The man said, "I would. The thing is, I am Coco the Clown." So on a personal note, Chabad Shluchim are those who always must represent optimism, faith, and joy, and distribute good cheer and energy to all. But what happens when a Chabad Shliach himself needs some support, needs some inspiration, needs to tap into his higher power, his higher vision, his higher soul? I can only speak for myself. For me, it happens by turning on a video clip of the Rebbe and watching my teacher and mentor in action. For me, this past year, one story I lived with was the following story of a man who had an urgent issue and decided to circumvent Chabad protocol. Instead of trying to get an audience with the Rebbe by way of his secretariat, he actually ambushed the Rebbe, so to speak, in front of his home as he came out of his home one morning to go to 770. He took 7 or 8 minutes of the Rebbe's time, and then he left. The Rebbe got into his car, headed to 770, and the man was then accosted by 2 yeshiva bachrim, 2 yeshiva students who were watching from afar. And they began to berate him. They admonished him, "How dare you take 7 or 8 precious, valuable minutes of the Rebbe's time like this?" He felt so terrible that he decided to write a note to the Rebbe to apologize. And that's what he did. And he wrote to the Rebbe, "I apologize for taking your time. How can I be forgiven?" The Rebbe wrote back 2 points in his answer. The first one was, the time we had our conversation was actually during yeshiva time, so those 2 boys should have been studying at the yeshiva rather than admonishing. That's point number 1. Let's set the record straight. And as for your request for forgiveness, the Rebbe said, the holy Baal Shem Tov taught something deeply moving. He said that a soul could descend into this world and spend 70 or 80 years just in order to do one favor for another. The Rebbe then said, who knows? Perhaps our conversation today was that one favor. And what I love about the story is that to the Rebbe, every encounter was viewed as perhaps this is the one. It's that story of complete and utter dedication to one's cause, to one's mission, that embodied principle number 2. This lofty ideal finds practical expression in the way a leader goes about counseling those who come to see him. Does he put them and their interests entirely before his own? Can he suspend his own agenda or cause, however grand, however noble, in order to counsel the person before him with their best interest in mind? Consider the following story. There's a wealthy philanthropist in LA. His name is, he passed away since, but Rabbi Beryl Weiss. He did tremendous chesed, and he once consulted with the Rebbe about taking his business public. I just want to preface this story that each one of these stories, at least parts of it, are very specific to the particular individual and circumstance. But in this case, he begins to explain to the Rebbe that selling a substantial stake in his business would bring him a considerable amount of money. And he promised that as soon as this took place, he would donate $1 million to Chabad. This is going back maybe 30, 40 years. It was a very substantial sum. And the Rebbe, as you might know, had many places where he can spend that money on many different good causes. I remember hearing a story from someone in Melbourne, Australia, when I was a shaliach there for a few years as a bacher. The man came to the Rebbe, I think in the 70s, with a check for $1 million and said, this is for you to utilize in any one of your causes. About a week or so later, he came back to the Rebbe and he says, you know, in the interim, I became emotionally connected to a particular cause within Chabad. Could I recommend spending it on this particular cause? To which the Rebbe said, sorry, it's too late. I've spent it already. When the Rebbe received, he spent it immediately. That was his view. He once admonished a free loan society who came very proudly to the Rebbe and said, oh, we have a surplus of a few $100,000 in the account. We're doing so well. The Rebbe said, you call that doing very well? A successful year for a free loan society is having nothing in the account. In any event, he shares this with the Rebbe, and imagine this. What does the Rebbe say to him? Now, while of course the Rebbe had so many things to spend the money on, he strongly advised Weiss on not taking his company public. And he said to him, why would you want to give away so much control of your business to others? Again, this was specific to that case. I'm not saying that as a policy the Rebbe suggested not to take a company public, but in this person's circumstances, again, despite the man having promised a tremendous sum of money to charity that was very necessary and could have been well used, the Rebbe put all of that aside because what he was there to do was respond to this man's personal question and take his particular interests into account. Another example, Jerry Levine was an award-winning anchorman for Miami's Channel 10 News. And in 1989, the local Chabad Shliach Rabbi Shalom Bar Lipsker asked him to work for his organization, a wonderful organization called Aleph, which assists Jewish prisoners and military personnel and their families around the world. Jerry was intrigued by the opportunity, but he couldn't decide whether or not to take this offer. At Rabbi Lipsker's suggestion, he wrote a letter to the Rebbe asking his advice, explaining what he was doing at the time and what he hoped to accomplish in his professional life. The Rebbe's response was, ask the advice of a good friend. Jerry said later on in an interview, what I got from that is that this is a different sort of leader. Any other leader would have been thinking, in what manner can this person help our organization grow? What is the marketing potential for our organization? How can he help with news releases or press coverage? And the Rebbe was not thinking about any of that at all. Again, I must say, much of what I'm sharing with you today inspires me personally as a Chabad Shaliach, almost on a day-to-day basis, to literally suspend all calculations for the good of our community, of the Jewish people, of humanity by extension, when in conversation with an individual who is coming to see me for a particular thing, reflecting their particular needs at that time. In these instances, among others, the Rebbe embodied a rare personal insight he once gave to Rabbi Herbert Weiner into his own modus operandi, and I quote, when a person comes to see me with a problem, this is how I try to help them. A man knows his own personal problems best, so one must try to unite with him and become batal, which means as disassociated as possible from one's own ego. Then, In concert with the other person, one tries to understand the principle of divine providence in his or her particular case. In sum, true leaders see themselves as being there to help actualize the dreams and aspirations of the people that they lead and represent rather than the other way around. Principle 3, the tree from the forest. While exact numbers are hard to come by, according to Miss Susan Handelman, a professor at Bar Ilan University, the Rebbe would receive around 400 letters a day. Purportedly, research done by the New York Postal Service in the 80s found that after the mayor of New York, the Rebbe received the most non-commercial mail in all of New York State. And yet the Rebbe made time to answer each one of them personally. Not only did he respond to each letter personally, but he took the time to sign his name at considerable cost to his precious time. In the introduction to the letter and the spirit, a collection of letters of the Rebbe's personal secretary, Dr. Winston Mendel, who served as one of his secretaries, he mentions the following very moving anecdote. He said, "I once boldly suggested that there may be a way to save the Rebbe some time with regards to outgoing mail. I referred to the so-called standard letters, such as Rosh Hashanah greetings, responses to requests for the Rebbe's blessing for simchas like bar mitzvahs, weddings, and so forth, all of which together numbered thousands and thousands each year. Now, if the Rebbe would permit to have such letters signed by a rubber stamp, which of course is a universally accepted practice, there's something called the presidential pen. Many such things exist. He said it would certainly save the Rebbe considerable precious time. With due acknowledgement of his secretary's thoughtfulness, the Rebbe politely rejected the idea out of hand. The explanation he gave was simple. How can I send prayerful wishes to a person in such an artificial manner? He said, how would anyone feel receiving from his Rebbe good wishes in a letter signed by a rubber stamp? This story is not an isolated snapshot of a great leader. I would venture to say that it captures the essence, if you will, of the Rebbe's way of reaching people and his successful effort to change the landscape of world Jewry. This story about the Rebbe's signature, then, is signature Rebbe. The Rebbe believed to his core in the value of each and every individual. He never lost sight of each tree in the forest and would often quote the Talmudic teaching that he who saves one individual is as if he saved the world entire. Indeed, as his behavior constantly demonstrated, to him each individual was an entire world. To quote Diane Abrams, the wife of former New York State Attorney General Bob Abrams, the Rebbe was always focused on the other person. His sensitivity to others heightened to an incredible degree. This was one of his great powers, his great strength. When standing before him, you felt that you were the only person in the world. In distinction to the philosophy of many heads of state and creators of movements, the Rebbe believed that while building a movement or advancing the overall good of the state was important, it must never eclipse the importance of being attuned to each individual. Let's look at text 6. In a pre-Passover pastoral letter written by the Rebbe in 1964, he elaborates on this theme. This message is of particular importance to leaders of groups and movements, and especially to those who occupy the position of spiritual leaders of their communities. All too often they are involved in quote-unquote world problems, in tremendous issues, while only occasionally, or even quite rarely, do we find a leader who stoops to engage in quote small ordinary problems besetting the daily life, problems which directly concern his congregants. The more prominent the leader, the more acutely is he compelled to address himself to all humanity. If he is particularly imaginative, he sees himself called upon to speak also to posterity. Should he be blessed with oratorical powers, he considers it his duty to arouse the world conscience with all the powers of his eloquence, which make headlines, so that he comes to be regarded as a leader of leaders and the voice of spokesmen who envy his public image and seek to emulate him and even outdo him. After engaging in such lofty resolutions, it would hardly be fitting to sound the alarm on ordinary problems in daily life. The Rebbe didn't just preach these words. He lived and embodied them. There was a 12-year-old girl who wrote a letter to the Rebbe, and at the end of the letter, she wrote a message to the Rebbe in code. In code. By rearranging Hebrew letters according to a particular system, she sent the Rebbe a message, if I remember correctly, blessing the Rebbe to have children. She receives a letter some weeks later, and the Rebbe responded to her in the same code, thanking her for her beautiful blessing. To my mind, the stories like that encapsulate this idea of the attention to the individual, entering their world, connecting to them in their universe. Indeed, remarkably, as opposed to most leaders who become less accessible to the public over time, the Rebbe made himself more available to the public as the years went by. Famously, this culminated in his legendary practice of handing out dollars to thousands of individuals from all walks of life on Sundays. As opposed to typical global leaders whose meetings are heavily vetted and highly prioritized, as the years went by, the Rebbe made himself available to literally anyone who wanted his blessing or counsel. Incidentally, this makes for some fascinating viewing online of these encounters, because you get to see literally the range and scope of all types of people, none of whom are vetted as they walk by the Rebbe, some of them with quite outlandish claims and requests. And it's fascinating to see, as mentioned before, that as the years go by, the Rebbe eliminates that which keeps him from literally anyone and everyone who wants to see him and receive his blessing. While conventional wisdom for leadership repeatedly emphasizes the importance of seeing the forest from the trees, the Rebbe taught his followers, by word and by example, never lose sight of each tree from the forest. And so the third principle highlights the importance of never allowing the bigger picture or the collective agenda to come at the expense of the needs of the individuals you are there to serve. Principle 4. This is not the why of leadership or the who, but the what. What is the dream? Text 4. In a letter addressed to the second president of Israel, Yitzchak ben Tzvi, the Rebbe wrote the following. From the time that I was a child attending Cheder, and even earlier than that, there began to take form in my mind a vision of the future redemption. The redemption of the Jewish people from its last exile. Redemption such as would explain the suffering, the decrees, and the massacres of exile. Wherever you look in the Lubavitcher Rebbe's teachings, there it is. The dream. Sometimes implicit, but more often explicit in his talks and letters, one encounters the aspiration that is closest to his heart. The desire to see our imperfect world enter an era devoid of war, devoid of suffering, and replete with goodness and the pursuit of godly knowledge and consciousness. Indeed, the clearest iteration of the Rebbe's dream I know of was articulated on the very night he assumed the mantle of Chabad leadership, the 10th of Shvat, 1951. He began his very first Hasidic discourse by quoting a verse from the Song of Songs. Basi Legani, I have come into my garden. Text 5, he explained, the garden is our world, which God refers to not as a garden, but as my garden. Of all the myriad spiritual emanations and worlds, there is only one to which God refers to as mine, because it is only here, the very lowest realm, that he wants to call home. The Rebbe then continued to share a beautiful midrashic narrative. In fact, an overview, if you will, of Jewish history at a glance. And I quote, God's Shekhinah, his presence, was here when he created this world, but it was driven away by a series of sins, starting with Adam and Eve's eating from the tree of knowledge. Subsequent sinful generations drove the Shekhinah further away, and it ascended from one heaven to the next. After the sins of 7 generations had caused the Shekhinah to withdraw 7 spiritual levels from its initial manifestation in this world, there arose 7 tzaddikim, whose service of God drew this divine presence down into this world once more. Through the merit of Avraham, the Shekhinah was brought down from the 7th to the 6th. Through the merit of Yitzchak, from the 6th to the 5th, and so on. Until Moshe, the 7th of these tzaddikim, drew the revelation of the Shekhinah down once again into this world below. But through the sin of the golden calf, the Shekhinah was once again driven from this world. Drawing on the fact that he was addressing the 7th generation of Chabad Hasidim, the Rebbe concluded fervently, and I quote, "We are also the 7th generation. And like Moshe, who was the 7th, it is up to us to complete the job and usher in the final redemption. We are the last generation of this exile. We will be the ones to greet Mashiach. We are making the final touches, polishing the buttons. These are the last preparations for a world as it was meant to be." There it is. The Rebbe's ambitious dream, nothing less than bringing humanity across the finish line of history and ushering in the Messianic era through spreading spiritual awareness and inspiring a revolution of goodness and kindness. So Principle 4 teaches us to find the area of activism that makes us tick, that one would be willing to sacrifice their life for. Identify your dream, articulate your vision for a better world, and allow that to inspire and guide your efforts to make the world and society a better place. Principle 5, every dream needs a plan. This is, if you will, the weir of leadership. A charming story is told about the Rebbe's early plans, and it comes to us by way of a letter written to Rabbi Simon Jacobson, the author of Towards a Meaningful Life. In the letter, a woman named Nechama Cohen, who grew up in Crown Heights and had been befriended by the Rebbe through a chance meeting on the street, writes of an early childhood encounter she had with the Rebbe, who was known to her at the time as Mr. Menachem. Mr. Menachem always asked me what books I was reading, she says. When I was 7, in the spring of 48, I discovered science fiction in the library on Schenectady Avenue. I loved it. I gave him rave reviews of 2 authors, Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov. One year, a year or so later, I told him about Asimov's book titled The Foundation. If you haven't read this book, or the Foundation series, she says, I should tell you it's about a secret foundation set up by a psychohistorian named Harry Seldon. The purpose of psychohistory and the foundation was to perfect the universe, which is basically what I told Mr. Menachem. Anyway, Mr. Menachem later told me that he read the book, which floored me. He then said that he took the time to write to Asimov and he'd received a reply. I was thrilled that Asimov thought enough of him to write back. At the time, I had no concept of who he truly was, and definitely no idea of who he would become. He was corresponding with Asimov, and as far as I was concerned, that was even better than writing to Jackie Robinson, which I think I told him. Then he asked me what I thought of the idea of setting up a foundation to perfect the world. I thought it was better than Asimov and Robinson combined, and I told him so. He then told me that he was setting up just such a foundation. I was so excited, I started to jump up and down, and I told him I wanted to join. He said that I could. Well, he did set it up, and I did join. He was talking about Chabad and his worldwide network of devoted emissaries. Another memorable iteration of the dream surfaces in 1972 at a Farbrengen, which celebrated the Rebbe's 70th birthday. On that occasion, the Rebbe called for the establishment of 70 new institutions around the world. Rabbi Shlomo Kunin, who's the director of Chabad activities in California, undertook to establish 10 new Chabad houses in California that year. At the same Farbrengen, Rabbi Kunin brought several donors to the Rebbe to present him with a key to a Chabad house that they had recently opened. The Rebbe told them, and I quote, "If you're giving me the key, then it becomes my house. And if it's my house, I would like its doors to be open 24 hours a day and 7 days a week for anyone in need." He added, "This is going to start a pattern. It will be like a chain store. Soon there will be Chabad houses all over the country." As of today, newsflash, Chabad maintains institutions in thousands of cities and over 100 countries around the world, with a new center opening approximately once every 10 days. And there are an estimated 5,000 plus Chabad shluchim around the world. Friends, apparently, the Rebbe's secret foundation is a secret no longer. So principle 5 is to translate your dream into a vision. Take what you want to do and turn it into a defined journey with a specific destination. Where do you want to get to, and by when? Principle 6, everyone plays a part. This is the how of leadership. The big question is, how did the Rebbe do it? How did he galvanize a small and devastated group of Hasidim who had barely survived the horrors of the Holocaust into becoming the largest Jewish organization in the world? In the early years of his leadership, someone close to the Rebbe asked him, Rebbe, you have all these wonderful grand plans, but who will help you implement those plans? The type of people you currently have are not qualified. He said the older ones are worn down from persecution, and the younger ones are spoiled Americans who are not capable of the sacrifices that will be required of them. Making reference to a holy book called Sefer Yetzirah, or the Book of Formation, whose creative powers were used by certain mystics throughout Jewish history, the Rebbe responded, what should I do? Take the book, Sefer Yetzirah, and create new people? In other words, I will work with anyone and everyone who is willing to be part of this holy mission. And that became a hallmark of the Rebbe's army. Pretty much the only criteria you need to be a shliach or shlucha is to have the passion and the desire to serve. Put differently, through his own personal example, I'd say the Rebbe actually did create a new type of person. One who wakes up each morning and asks, not what can others do for me, but what can I do for others? And how did he do it? Through the power of his belief in every person he encountered, to contribute to the mission in their own sphere of influence, in their own way, and through their own network and talents. Here is an excerpt of a talk given by the former chief rabbi of the Commonwealth of the UK, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. I came to 770, and eventually the moment came when I was ushered into the Rebbe's study. I asked him all of my intellectual and philosophical questions, and he gave me intellectual and philosophical answers, and then he did something no one else had done before. He did a role reversal. It was he who started asking me questions. Questions like, what are you doing to build up Jewish life at Cambridge? Now he said, I had not come to see the Rebbe to become a Chabad shliach. I'd come to ask a few simple questions, and all of a sudden he was challenging me. That moment changed my life forever. Here I was, a nobody from nowhere, and here was one of the greatest Jewish leaders in the Jewish world challenging me, challenging me to take on a leadership role. And it was then that I realized something that I've said many times since. A good leader creates followers, but a great leader creates leaders. That's what the Rebbe did for me and for thousands of others. He took young people and he gave them huge responsibilities and he guided them as they grew. That took vision. That took courage. It also took faith. From the Rebbe, I learned how faith in God helps you have faith in people, challenging them to become greater than they might otherwise have become. Believing in them, he helped them believe in themselves. One of my favorite stories is told about Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht, who was a Chabad Shaliach in New Haven, Connecticut, where actually I was born and raised. And he was based there since 1941. The demand on him grew year by year with a synagogue, a school, a yeshiva, and many other responsibilities that required a staff several times larger than what he could afford. In 1974, he wrote to the Rebbe complaining that in the 33 years of his service, he felt like he was back at the very same place as when he started. And he wrote to the Rebbe, I simply can't continue. He signed off the letter with a heart-rending plea that, quote, the Rebbe should help and do all he can. The Rebbe responded, I've already followed your advice. I've sent dear Rabbi Moshe Yitzchak Hecht. But it appears from your letter and from those preceding it that you still are not familiar with him and with his capabilities with which this man was endowed. Whatever the case, you should get to know him now. Immediately, everything will change. Your mood, your trust in God, your everyday happiness, etc. No matter who you were or what you did in life, the Rebbe was a genius at identifying a way in which you could serve as a beacon of light to others and empowering you to do so. We have another video here, but we'll leave it perhaps for a different time. In short, this is a video of Rabbi Fishel Jacobs, who began his life as an award-winning international superstar in martial arts. Understandably, he wasn't a very religious Jew. And at some point, he began to come closer to Yiddishkeit. And in the video, he shares his yechidus with the Rebbe, during which the Rebbe turned to him and said, "Do you have smicha yet? Do you have rabbinic ordination?" He said, "No." It was the furthest thing from his mind. The Rebbe then encouraged him to get smicha and to get it done in a very quick period of time. He said that was by far the most difficult thing I'd ever done. Not only that, he became a dayan afterwards, and he's written numerous halachic works. And he says something very moving in that interview. He said, anyone looking at me that time in my life would never have seen in me a potential rabbi. But the Rebbe honed in on that potential, and he allowed me to see myself as such and activate that tremendous potential. One of my favorite stories is told about the former Prime Minister of Israel, Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin had a very close relationship with the Rebbe, and once during a yechidus with the Rebbe, I was told the Rebbe turned to him and asked him for a personal favor. The Rebbe tells him, "I received a letter from a family in Paris. They have a daughter who fell in love with someone who isn't Jewish, and they are trying to encourage her to find a Jewish partner. And no matter which arguments they make, she does not accept them. I happen to know," says the Rebbe, "that she is a huge fan of yours." And the Rebbe asked Menachem Begin if he would stop off in Paris on his way back to Israel and speak to her, find a way of trying to encourage her to find a Jewish partner in life. I was told that he did this, and she ended up marrying someone Jewish. To me, that is an incredible story. While a very proud Jew, Menachem Begin wasn't necessarily what you would call a typical Chabad shliach. And yet the Rebbe turned him into one. The Rebbe managed to find an area in his life where he can encourage, illuminate, and elevate the life of another Jew across the world. In another beautiful story, a physics student at Pennsylvania University, Yaakov Hanoka, took a year's break from his studies and he got involved with Yiddishkeit, to the point that in a yechidus with the Rebbe, he suggested to the Rebbe that he discontinue his PhD in favor of getting rabbinic semicha. And as a way of trying to make the case to the Rebbe, he said, and in this way, I'll be able to then go off to a university and become a local Chabad rabbi and bring youth back to Judaism. Imagine his surprise when the Rebbe told him, "I want you to go back to the university and finish your PhD. But Rebbe, Dr. Hanoka, then Yaakov said to the Rebbe respectfully, he said, "If I stay on in yeshiva, I could become a rabbi on campus." The Rebbe answered with a smile, "You will accomplish more for Yiddishkeit with 3 initials after your name." Another important story. An activist came to see the Rebbe to discuss a topic that was of grave concern to the Rebbe, but it had also become a point of contention within the Jewish community. The visitor was critical of a certain Jewish leader because of his lenient stance on a fundamental issue of Jewish law. And he suggested to break off all working relationships with that Jewish leader. The Rebbe disagreed. "It is true," says the Rebbe, "that on one mitzvah we differ, but there are another 612 mitzvot which we can work together on." It was the Rebbe's singular commitment to the mission that led him to focus on that which united rather than divided, and see in every person he encountered a potential ally, even ambassador, for the cause of goodness and world repair. And ultimately, the following story encapsulates the Rebbe's strategy of influence perhaps more than any other. A new rabbi on university campus in Wisconsin, he later went on to Australia, you could say his name, Rabbi Leibel Wolf. He was feeling overwhelmed at the time by the magnitude of his role. "Rebbe," he asked in a yechidus, "how am I, one individual, supposed to reach the 7,000 Jewish students that attend my university?" The Rebbe responded, "Your job is not to work with 7,000. Your job is to work with 7. Those 7 will reach another 7, who will in turn reach another 7 ad infinitum." True and lasting influence is accumulative rather than abrupt, and happens slowly but surely rather than suddenly. One person, one good deed, and one day at a time. So principle 6 is to find the potential and the areas of strength in the people you lead and empower them to become leaders in their own right, transforming them from passive recipients to proactive proponents of your noble cause. Principle 7 is role modeling, the when. I believe that more than any other factor or influencer, it was the Rebbe's own personal example that helped activate the spirit of altruism and activism in everyone he encountered. I can definitely speak for myself. In over 40 years of leadership, the Rebbe never took one day of vacation. He responded to the hundreds of letters he received daily, and 3 times weekly for a period of time, he would spend the entire night receiving people in need from all over the world. He spent hundreds of hours on Shabbat afternoons giving talks, fusing Torah with contemporary issues and inspiration. Upon the conclusion of Jewish holidays, Passover, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, and Sukkot, the Rebbe would personally distribute to thousands of visitors a few drops of wine from the cup over which he had made Havdalah. I remember growing up in New Haven, Connecticut, having time after a 2-day, sometimes 3-day holiday to make the journey by car to Crown Heights. And you would think those lines had thinned by the time we arrived. They were as long as ever. I know what it's like as a rabbi after a 2-day, 3-day Yom Tif. When Havdalah comes, you know what we want to do? We want to retreat for a few minutes. The Rebbe didn't retreat. The Rebbe channeled that momentum, that energy, into thousands of personal encounters to distribute blessing, to distribute good energy, and to distribute inspiration. Famously, on the Sunday mornings, he would stand for hours on end and hand out dollars to be distributed for tzedakah. Why did he do all of this himself? I've often wondered. Couldn't he have appointed a senior member of his staff or the community to distribute these dollars or wine of blessing and honey cake? But perhaps he wanted to model the importance of leading a life of service to every single person he encountered. No one could then say, well, helping others is nice, but I don't have the time. If the Rebbe, who was running a worldwide Jewish organization, could take the time from his hectic schedule, so could anyone. And in so many ways, the Rebbe conveyed a sense of urgency about his mission, embodying the teaching of Hillel, if not now, when? He would often say about the growing apathy and assimilation of our times that a fire is raging, and we must all become firemen and help put out those destructive fires. It reminds me of the story of the business person who was visiting Detroit, a chassid from London. And he met a Jew who inquired about tefillin. And the chassid answered his questions, and then he asked if the man owned a pair of tefillin. The man said no. The chassid said, I will buy you a pair. He then returned from Detroit to New York on his way back to London for a family reunion, and he wrote a little note to the Rebbe mentioning this episode and telling the Rebbe that when he would return to Detroit 6 weeks later, he would return with a pair of tefillin in hand as a gift for this man. The next morning, the Rebbe's secretary handed this chassid an urgent note just before he was to fly. After blessing him with success, the Rebbe wrote, and I quote, "Is it right that a Jew who put on tefillin yesterday, perhaps for the first time in years or even his life, should wait 6 weeks for you to bring him a pair of tefillin? Please buy the tefillin today. And if you can send them to Detroit in time for him to put them on today, do so. And if not, go back to Detroit yourself and help put on those tefillin with him today, even if it means you won't be home for Shabbos." On a separate occasion, a community activist from Berlin visited the Rebbe for Simchas Torah. As the Rebbe was dancing around in a circle with the Torah scroll, he turned to him and he says, "See to it that Berlin becomes a place filled with Hasidische Warmkeit, with Hasidic warmth." "Amen," the man replied enthusiastically. The Rebbe continued circling the bima. To the man's astonishment, as the Rebbe passed him again, he smiled and demanded, "Nu, what have you done to implement our recent conversation?" The next morning, on his way to services, the Rebbe again spotted the same individual, and he said, "At this point, an entire night has gone by. So tell me, what have you accomplished so far?" There was never a moment when the Rebbe was not completely switched on to the mission. To be sure, living at that level of complete identification with one's purpose at all times is supremely difficult. But there is no doubt that watching the Rebbe go about every moment of his life with that sense of divine consciousness surely profoundly influenced his students and those he encountered to raise their levels of spiritual awareness and personal mission as well. And so in sum, the 7 questions outlined are, to my mind, the best way to formulate your personal 7 principles of leadership, which I believe, if kept front and center of your heart and mind will assure lasting success. A quick recap. Question 1, why do you seek out leadership? What is your motivation to lead? Is it a career or a calling? Question 2, are you here to self-actualize or to help actualize others? In other words, do you view the people you lead as a platform for your own self-actualization, or do you view yourself as a platform for theirs? Question 3, have you lost touch with the individuals you first set out to help? Do you prioritize the needs of your cause over the needs of the people your cause is meant to assist? Don't lose sight of the solitary tree, even as you set your sights on the sweeping and majestic forest. Question 4, what is the goal to which you have devoted yourself? Is it worthwhile? Does it consume you? Is it the last thing you think about when you go to sleep at night and the first thing you think about when you wake up in the morning? Does it better the world in some way? If so, how? Question 5, have you envisioned the finale? Have you imagined it? Do you see it? If so, what does it look like? Does it elevate humanity, bring people together, raise levels of divine consciousness? Question 6, how are you getting from dream to destination? What is your plan? How will you galvanize the people you lead to make your vision their own? Do you believe in them to the point that you allow them to represent you? Do you take or make the challenges and differences you encounter along the way personal? Or are you so focused on the goal that you only see how people and situations can play a part in the mission? Question 7, finally, do you live and breathe your project, your cause, your purpose? Are you the best advertisement for your cause? Is your passion all-consuming? Do you view your mission with the same urgency as a fireman does his? Allow me to conclude with a postscript relating to the last point about the Rebbe's sense of urgency. I would argue that that sense of emergency which accompanied the Rebbe from the very first moment of his leadership did not ease or dissipate, but only intensified over the years. And I would posit that the same sense of urgency which permeated all areas of the Rebbe's leadership only accelerated over time in relation to the fulfillment of his childhood dream, the coming of Mashiach. Indeed, the Rebbe's desperate yearning for Mashiach's coming was crystallized in a slogan, later turned into a song that many of you might have seen. You can go on YouTube and find videos of this where the Rebbe encourages the Hasidim to sing, "We want Mashiach now. We don't want to wait." And so, in conclusion, as we approach this year, I cannot help but think about a little-known but profoundly significant comment the Rebbe made, seemingly in passing, at a Farbrengen on the 5th of Tammuz, 1989, 5 years before his passing, almost to the day. Text 7. The Rebbe Rayatz once related that the saintly Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev said before his passing, there have been spiritual giants who before their passing promised their contemporaries that they would not enter the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden, or paradise until by their insistent intercession they had ensured the coming of Mashiach, except that ultimately they allowed themselves to be bribed by divine revelations and spiritual bliss. But I won't let anyone fool me. The Rebbe Rayatz concluded, ultimately, however, Rabbi Levi was fooled as well. They said the prayer of Kedusha in Gan Eden, and Rabbi Levi Yitzchak couldn't contain himself. He jumped right in to recite Amen. The Rebbe then said, listen to this. The correct approach here is to take an oath, according to the knowledge and consent of the public, in which case the law is that, quote, there is no disavowal of the oath without public consent. Even if one can convince one or even a few of the group to annul it, it doesn't help. God's Torah rules that an oath taken by public approbation is not annulled. In other words, even while physically with us, the Rebbe was trying to find ways to ensure that after his passing, he would remain inextricably bound up with his mission on earth. And so I would posit that just as the Rebbe made his life's mission while physically here, to quote, not allow God to rest until he brings Mashiach, I'm sure he is continuing to rally the heavens until his childhood vision of the future redemption comes true speedily in our time. And in the meantime, let each one of us do our part in bringing about the transformative messianic reality through acts of goodness and kindness, From the words of the Rambam, the Rebbe would quote very often, text 8, one should see the world and himself as a scale with an equal balance of good and evil. When he does one evil deed, the scale is tipped to the bad. And when he does one good deed, the scale is tipped to the good. And he brings salvation and redemption to the world. Thank you.